Good. All right. The other piece I wanted to deal with, okay, we've talked about introducing yourself with the organization, trying to remind you a little bit about the different component pieces you're going to be following. Next week, when you come in, we'll talk about the paper itself, the final project proposal that you will be working with. And we'll go through the components there. But today, for some of the groups that are really ready to move ahead, and if you've done your reading and so forth, I just wanted to briefly go over some tips that have to do with people's needs that we're going to be looking at versus the problem statement that you were reading about. They can be differentiated, and you probably already know what those differentiations are. A need from our reading can generally be described as a local feeling, is localized within the community. Again, if we're talking about Westgate housing, there may be some profound needs that are felt among the stakeholders with the board and the executive director and so forth that could possibly be met through the design of a particular project. That's great. Also, in understanding a little bit about that need, what we need to do, what you'll be looking at is, again, a lot of this is common sense. You'll be looking at the context, where Westgate housing is situated and so forth, what has been the history of Westgate housing in the Brattleboro community and West Brattleboro and so forth. You're going to be looking at their immediate situation as well. You have the context. You're going to be looking at the situation by talking with stakeholders and so forth. Their funding levels over the last few years, what they're struggling with. And also we'll go back to see, okay, what is the Westgate Housing Organization all about? What is their mission? So all those three things combined in terms of beginning to ascertain need. One thing that is very, very important as we're looking at need is to make sure that you're not tricked into thinking, into looking at organizational needs. What can you do for Alana? What can you do for Westgate Housing? What can you do for SIT? Again, what you're going to be doing, the high road in terms of project design is going to have to do with, now wait a minute, it is the people, the stakeholders of Alana, their need, and so forth. It is the stakeholders, those that are living in the housing of Westgate, those that are participating. So that is the way you situate and differentiate yourself as you're looking at need, is try to differentiate between, okay, what is need organizationally and what is the compelling need of the people themselves. Training, counseling, services, and that sort of thing. You got it? They're more action verb oriented here. So you're going to be looking at need, and if you did your reading, you'll also be looking at the social factors as you're doing your assessment, your needs assessment. You're going to be looking at the social factors, again, the context and situation. But okay, who is comprising? What are the relationships in the association? What are the relationships? What's going on? Their families, their structure, their age, their gender. There's all sorts of activities there at work. And finally, in this needs assessment also, you're going to be looking at the resources that are available as you're doing the needs assessment as well. What do they have? What have they been using? We talked about that last week, as you remember, as we talked about our systems approach to project design. We talked about inputs, the resources, money, people, time, and so forth. These are resources that you need to recognize as you're working in context, that are technology and so forth. In addition to what the processes, the action verbs of how are these resources being put to work. The outputs, as you remember, had to do with the units, the number of training sessions, the number of school buses that are being used and so forth in a particular project or program. And then, of course, what we're all looking for right here in the end is that as you're doing all this, we're constantly looking at people's needs, right? People's needs in terms of eventually getting outcome. How can we meet those needs? The impact that the project's going to have in all of this. All right, so need localized. Localized. The difference between need and problem, a problem statement has to do with its dimension. A problem, as you saw in your reading, has to do with something more fundamental, something more rooted, not only in Brattleboro or an Alana organization and so forth, but in the context of Vermont, New England, the United States, the two-thirds world, and so forth. So, one simple definition of this has to do with, and we'll refine this, I'll have some paper in your box about all this. A problem, we shall say, is an undesirable condition or conditions. Okay, in the future, now we'll deal with this next week. It's an undesirable condition that we will find in the future that affects people in a negative way. Now the thing that PPBD students and project designers get tripped up on is the notion of, well, what do you mean the future? If people are hungry, aren't they hungry now? Weren't they hungry yesterday? The answer to that is yes. But as a project designer, that's not what it's all about. It's about solving a problem in the future. We are trying to resolve hunger. We are trying to offer training that will empower women, men, children, and so forth in the future. So, by having our statements, and we'll do this, this is very, very important because we're going to be, as my friend, the grant writer that we're going to have in a few weeks out says, is that the needs assessment and the problem statement is the most important aspect of your project design. Because if you get that right, if we get this right in working with Alana, Westgate, Insight, whoever it may be, then the project design is going to flow from that. And so, all right, the other piece that has to do with the problem is that, here was a good example I used this morning, I think. My wife, Maria, I think I mentioned works out of Greenfield, Massachusetts with the Western Massachusetts Training Consortium. She works with trauma survivors, families, women, children with trauma issues and so forth. There's a basic need in the region for services. And those services have been forthcoming from the town, from the state of Massachusetts, from Boston and so forth for women and children there. So some of the needs have been met around trauma surviving issues and helping women and families. But what Maria saw and some colleagues saw is something that was even more fundamental. How this is not only about Franklin County. The reflections of the difficulties in alcoholism, abuse, and so forth in the county is related not only to the needs of the people, but is related to a larger issue, societal issue. And what they developed was a project design that shifted from the needs of women of Franklin County into a problem statement about empowering women and families, not only in the county, but used it as a model for Massachusetts and New England, in which a design was built where women, it was something called peer-to-peer counseling. In other words, before you had Massachusetts, Boston, providing services, social services and so forth out of the state, out of the county and so forth, that provided services for people. But what Maria and others did is created a project based on a problem statement that empowered women to actually become trainers themselves. Trauma survivors becoming trainers, becoming leaders, actually organizing businesses themselves through a peer-to-peer counseling program and